Welcome to the Thought Echo channel. I'm so glad you're joining me for story time today. Whether you're here to relax, learn, or just immerse yourself in a wonderful tale, you're in for a treat. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can join me for more stories and inspiration. Let's begin.
Step into a world where imagination knows no bounds, a world of red sands, twin moons, and ancient civilizations. A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs isn't just a story. It's an epic journey to the mysterious planet of Mars, or as its inhabitants call it, Barsoom. Follow the incredible tale of John Carter, a soldier of Earth who finds himself mysteriously transported to this alien world. There, amidst towering cities and endless deserts, he encounters strange creatures, fierce warriors, and the beautiful yet brave Dejathoris, a princess unlike any other. This timeless classic blends adventure, romance, and science fiction in a way that has captivated readers for over a century. As you listen, prepare to lose yourself in a Martian world where bravery, honor, and love collide against a backdrop of interplanetary war and discovery. So sit back, close your eyes, and let the story of a princess of Mars carry you to a place far beyond our world. A place where heroes are made and legends are born. Let's begin. Chapter 25, The Looting of Sodonga. As the great gate where I stood swung open, my 50 Tharks, headed by Tarkas himself, rode in upon their mighty thoats. I led them to the palace walls, which I negotiated easily without assistance. Once inside, however, the gate gave me considerable trouble, but I was finally rewarded by seeing it swing upon its huge hinges. And soon my fierce escort was riding across the gardens of the Jeddak of Zodanga. As we approached the palace, I could see through the great windows of the first floor into the brilliantly illuminated audience chamber of Thenkosis. The immense hall was crowded with nobles and their women, as though some important function was in progress. There was not a guard in sight outside the palace, due, I presume, to the fact that the city and palace walls were considered impregnable. I came close and peered within, at one end of the chamber. Upon massive golden thrones encrusted with diamonds, sat Thenkosis and his consort, surrounded by officers and dignitaries of state. Before them stretched a broad aisle lined on either side with soldiery. As I looked, there entered this aisle at the far end of the hall the head of a procession, which advanced to the foot of the throne. First came 4 officers of the Jeddak's guard, bearing a huge salver on which rested, upon a cushion of scarlet silk, a great golden chain with a collar and padlock at each end. Behind them marched 4 more officers, carrying a similar salver that supported the magnificent ornaments of a prince and princess of the reigning house of Zodanga. At the foot of the throne, these 2 parties separated and halted, facing each other on opposite sides of the aisle. Then came more dignitaries, officers of the palace and the army. Finally, 2 figures entirely muffled in scarlet silk, so that not a feature of either was discernible, stopped at the foot of the throne, facing Thenkosis. When the rest of the procession had entered and taken their stations, Thenkosis addressed the couple standing before him. I could not hear his words, but presently 2 officers advanced and removed the scarlet robe from one of the figures. I saw then that Kantos Kan had failed in his mission, for it was Sathan, Prince of Zodanga, who stood revealed before me. Thenkosis took a set of ornaments from one of the salvers and placed one of the golden collars around his son's neck, snapping the padlock shut. After a few more words addressed to Sathan, he turned to the other figure. The officers removed the enshrouding silks, disclosing to my now comprehending view Dejathoris, Princess of Helium. The object of the ceremony was clear. In another moment, Dejathoris would be joined forever to the Prince of Zodanga, It was an impressive and beautiful ceremony, I presume. But to me, it seemed the most fiendish sight I had ever witnessed. As the ornaments were adjusted upon her beautiful figure and her collar of gold swung open in the hands of Thenkosis, I raised my long sword above my head and, with the heavy hilt, shattered the glass of the great window. I sprang into the midst of the astonished assemblage. With a bound, I was on the steps of the platform beside Thenkosis. As he stood riveted with surprise, I brought my long sword down upon the golden chain that would have bound Dejathoris to another. In an instant, all was confusion. 1,000 drawn swords menaced me from every quarter, and Sabin sprang upon me with a jeweled dagger he had drawn from his nuptial ornaments. I could have killed him as easily as a fly, but the age-old custom of Barsoom stayed my hand. Grasping his wrist as the dagger flew toward my heart, I held him as though in a vice, and, with my long sword, pointed to the far end of the hall. "Zodanga has fallen," I cried. "Look!" All eyes turned in the direction I had indicated, and there, forging through the portals of the entranceway, rode Tarkas and his 50 warriors on their great thoats. A cry of alarm and amazement broke from the assemblage, but no word of fear. In a moment, the soldiers and nobles of Zodanga were hurling themselves upon the advancing Tharks. Thrusting Sabin headlong from the platform, I drew Dejathoris to my side. Behind the throne was a narrow doorway, and in this, Thenkosis now stood facing me with a drawn long sword. In an instant, we were engaged, and I found no mean antagonist. As we circled upon the broad platform, I saw Sabin rushing up the steps to aid his father. But as he raised his hand to strike, Dejathoris sprang before him, and then my sword found the spot that made Sabin Jeddak of Zodanga. As his father rolled dead upon the floor, the new Jeddak tore himself free from Dejathoris' grasp, and again we faced each other. He was soon joined by a quartet of officers, and with my back against a golden throne, I fought once again for Dejathoris. I was hard-pressed to defend myself and yet not strike down Sabin, and with him, my last chance to win the woman I loved. My blade swung with the rapidity of lightning as I sought to parry the thrusts and cuts of my opponents. 2 I had disarmed, and 1 was down when several more rushed to aid their new ruler and to avenge the death of the old. As they advanced, there were cries of, "The woman! The woman! Strike her down! It is her plot! Kill her! Kill her!" Calling to Dejathoris to get behind me, I worked my way toward the little doorway behind the throne. However, the officers realized my intentions, and 3 of them sprang in behind me, blocking my chances of gaining a position where I could defend Dejathoris against an army of swordsmen. The Tharks were having their hands full in the center of the room, and I began to realize that nothing short of a miracle could save Dejathoris and myself when I saw Tarkas surging through the crowd of foes that swarmed about him. With one swing of his mighty long sword, he laid a dozen corpses at his feet, and so he hewed a pathway before him until, in another moment, he stood upon the platform beside me, dealing death and destruction right and left. The bravery of the Zodangans was awe-inspiring, and not one attempted to escape. When the fighting ceased, it was because only Tharks remained alive in the great hall. Other than Dejathoris and myself, Sabin lay dead beside his father, and the corpses of the flower of Zodangan nobility and chivalry covered the floor of the bloody shambles. My first thought when the battle was over was for Kanto's kin. Leaving Dejathoris in the care of Tarkas, I took a dozen warriors and hastened to the dungeons beneath the palace. The jailers had all left to join the fighters in the throne room, so we searched the labyrinthine prison without opposition. I called Kanto's can's name aloud in each new corridor and compartment, and finally, I was rewarded by hearing a faint response. Guided by the sound, We soon found him helpless in a dark recess. He was overjoyed at seeing me and to know the meaning of the fight, faint echoes of which had reached his prison cell. He told me that the air patrol had captured him before he reached the high tower of the palace, so he had not even seen Sab then. We discovered that it would be futile to attempt to cut away the bars and chains that held him prisoner. At his suggestion, I returned to search the bodies on the floor above for keys to open the padlocks of his cell and chains. Fortunately, among the first bodies I examined, I found his jailer, and soon we had Kanto's can with us in the throne room. The sounds of heavy firing, mingled with shouts and cries, came to us from the city's streets, and Tars Tarkas hastened away to direct the fighting outside. Kanto's can accompanied him to act as a guide. Meanwhile, the Green Warriors commenced a thorough search of the palace for other Zodangans and for loot, leaving Dejathoris and me alone. She had sunk into one of the golden thrones, and as I turned to her, she greeted me with a wan smile. "Was there ever such a man?" she exclaimed. "I know that Barsoom has never before seen your like. Can it be that all Earthmen are as you? Alone, a stranger, hunted, threatened, persecuted. You have done in a few short months what, in all the past ages of Barsoom, no man has ever done. Joined together the wild hordes of the sea bottoms and brought them to fight as allies of a red Martian people." "The answer is easy, Dejathoris," I replied, smiling. "It was not I who did it. It was love. Love for Dejathoris. A power that would work greater miracles than this you have seen." A pretty flush overspread her face, and she answered, "You may say that now, John Carter, and I may listen, for I am free. And more still I have to say." "Ere it is again too late," I returned. "I have done many strange things in my life, many things that wiser men would not have dared. But never in my wildest fancies have I dreamed of winning a Dejathoris for myself, for never had I dreamed that in the universe dwelt such a woman as the Princess of Helium. That you are a princess does not abash me, but that you are you is enough to make me doubt my sanity as I ask you, my princess, to be mine." "He does not need to be abashed who so well knew the answer to his plea before the plea was made," she replied, rising and placing her dear hands upon my shoulders. And so I took her in my arms and kissed her. And thus, in the midst of a city of wild conflict, filled with the alarms of war, with death and destruction reaping their terrible harvest around her, did Dejathoris, Princess of Helium, the daughter of Mars, the god of war, promise herself in marriage to John Carter, gentleman of Virginia. Chapter 26. Through Carnage to Joy. Sometime later, Tars Tarkas and Kanto's Can returned to report that Zodanga had been completely subdued. Her forces were entirely destroyed or captured, and no further resistance was expected from within. Several battleships had escaped, but thousands of war and merchant vessels were now under guard by Thark warriors. The lesser hordes had begun looting and quarreling among themselves, so it was decided that we would collect what warriors we could, man as many vessels as possible with Zodangan prisoners, and make for Helium without further delay. 5 hours later, we sailed from the roofs of the dock buildings with a fleet of 250 battleships carrying nearly 100,000 green warriors, followed by a fleet of transports carrying our thoats. Behind us, we left the stricken city in the brutal clutches of some 40,000 green warriors of the lesser hordes. They were looting, murdering, and fighting amongst themselves. In countless places, they had set the city ablaze, and columns of dense smoke rose above Zodanga as if to blot out the horrid sights from the eyes of heaven. In the middle of the afternoon, we sighted the scarlet and yellow towers of Helium. Shortly thereafter, a great fleet of Zodangan battleships rose from the besiegers' camps outside the city and advanced to meet us. The banners of helium had been strung from stem to stern on each of our mighty crafts, but the Zodangans needed no such sign to recognize us as enemies, for our green Martian warriors opened fire on them almost as soon as they left the ground. With their uncanny marksmanship, they raked the oncoming fleet with volley after volley. The twin cities of helium, realizing we were allies, dispatched hundreds of vessels to aid us, and thus began the first real air battle I had ever witnessed. The vessels carrying our green warriors circled above the contending fleets of helium and Zodanga, as their batteries were useless in the hands of the Tharks, who, having no navy, lacked any naval gunnery skills. However, their small arms fire proved most effective, and the outcome of the engagement was strongly influenced, if not wholly determined, by their presence. At first, the two forces circled at the same altitude, exchanging broadside after broadside. Then, a massive hole was torn in the hull of one of Zodanga's great battlecraft. With a lurch, it flipped completely over, its crew plunging helplessly to the ground 1,000 feet below, followed by the shattered vessel itself, which buried deeply into the loamy sea bottom. A wild cry of exultation rose from the Heliumite squadron, and they attacked the Zodangans with renewed ferocity. By a deft maneuver, two helium vessels gained a position above their adversaries, raining bombs from their keel batteries. One by one, helium's battleships managed to rise above the Zodangans. Soon, several Zodangan ships became drifting wrecks, and others attempted to escape, only to be surrounded by swarms of smaller individual flyers and besieged by helium's massive battleships, ready to deploy boarding parties. In just over an hour, the battle was over. The remaining Zodangan vessels, now under prize crews, were directed toward the cities of helium. There was a tragic side to the surrender of these mighty flyers, rooted in an age-old custom requiring commanders of defeated ships to signal surrender by voluntarily plunging to their deaths. One by one, the brave officers, holding their colors high, leapt from the towering bows of their crafts to their doom. The fighting only ceased when the commander of the fleet himself took the final plunge, marking the surrender of the remaining vessels. We signaled Helium's flagship to approach, and when it was within hailing distance, I announced that we had the Princess Degethoris on board and wished to transfer her to the flagship for immediate transport to the city. As the significance of my words dawned on them, a great cry arose from the flagship's decks. Moments later, the Princess of Helium's colors unfurled from 100 points on her upper works. When the other ships of the fleet caught the meaning of the signals, they echoed the wild acclaim and displayed her colors proudly in the gleaming sunlight. The flagship bore down upon us, and as she swung gracefully alongside, a dozen officers sprang onto our decks. Their astonished gaze fell upon the hundreds of green warriors emerging from their shelters, and they stopped aghast. At the sight of Kanto's can advancing to meet them, however, they relaxed and moved forward, crowding around him. Degethoris and I then stepped forward, and instantly all eyes were on her. She greeted them with grace, calling each by name, for they were men of high esteem and service to her grandfather, and she knew them well. "Lay your hands upon the shoulder of John Carter," she said, turning toward me, "the man to whom Helium owes her princess as well as today's victory." The officers were courteous and spoke many kind and complimentary words. What seemed to impress them most was that I had won the allegiance of the fierce Tharks in my campaign for Degethoris's liberation and Helium's relief. "You owe your thanks more to another man than to me," I said. "Here he is. Meet one of Barsoom's greatest soldiers and statesmen, Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark." With the same polished courtesy they had shown me, the officers extended their greetings to Tars Tarkas. To my surprise, the great Thark matched their courtly manner with ease and grace. Though the Tharks are not a verbose race, they are formal, and their ways lend themselves to dignified and courtly behavior. Dejathoris boarded the flagship and was visibly displeased when I did not follow. But as I explained to her, the battle was only partly won. We still had to deal with the besieging Zodangan land forces, and I would not leave Taras Tarkas until the task was complete. The commander of Helium's naval forces promised to coordinate with the armies of Helium to launch a joint attack. The vessels then separated, and Dejathoris was borne triumphantly back to her grandfather, Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. In the distance lay our fleet of transports carrying the thoats of the Green Warriors. Without landing stages, it was a difficult task to unload the animals onto the open plain. Nonetheless, there was no alternative. We moved about 10 miles from the city and began the laborious process. The animals had to be lowered to the ground in slings, a task that occupied us for the rest of the day and into the night. Twice we were attacked by Zodangan cavalry, but the losses were minimal, and the attackers withdrew after nightfall. Once the last thoat was unloaded, Taras Tarkas gave the command to advance. Dividing into 3 groups, we crept upon the Zodangan camp from the north, south, and east. About a mile from the main camp, we encountered their outposts. As planned, this signaled the charge. With wild, ferocious cries and the nasty squeals of battle and raged thoats, we descended upon the Zodangans. They were not caught unprepared, and we found a well-entrenched battle line awaiting us. Time after time, we were repulsed. By noon, I began to fear for the outcome of the battle. The Zodangans had nearly 1 million fighting men, gathered from across Barsoom, while we had less than 100,000 Green Warriors. The Heliumite forces had yet to arrive, and we had no word of their progress. Just at noon, the sound of heavy firing erupted along the line between the Zodangans and the Twin Cities. Our much-needed reinforcements had arrived. Taras Tarkas ordered another charge, and once more the mighty thoats bore their riders against the enemy's ramparts. At the same time, Helium's forces surged over the Zodangan breastworks from the opposite side, crushing the enemy between our 2 forces like millstones. The Zodangans fought valiantly, but it was a futile effort. The plain before the city became a veritable shambles before the last Zodangan surrendered. Finally, the carnage ceased. Prisoners were marched back to Helium, and we entered the city in a triumphant procession of conquering heroes. The broad avenues were lined with cheering women, children, and the few men whose duties had kept them within the city during the battle. We were met with endless applause and showered with ornaments of gold, platinum, silver, and precious jewels. The city had gone mad with joy. The sight of my fierce Tharks caused the wildest excitement. Never before had an armed body of Green Warriors entered the gates of Helium, let alone as friends and allies. Their presence filled the Red Men with awe and rejoicing. That my efforts to save Dejathoris had become known to the Heliumites was evident from the cries of my name and the ornaments heaped upon me and my thoat as we paraded through the city. Even Wola, ferocious in appearance, was met with curiosity and admiration. As we approached the palace, a party of officers met us warmly and requested that Taras Tarkas, along with his Jeddaks, Jeds, and myself, dismount to receive the gratitude of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. At the top of the great steps leading to the palace stood the royal party. As we reached the lower steps, one figure descended to meet us. He was the epitome of manhood, tall, straight as an arrow, superbly muscled, and with the carriage of a natural leader. It was clear he was Tardos Mors. He first addressed Taras Tarkas, and his words cemented a lasting friendship between our races. Taras Tarkas, he said earnestly, to meet the greatest living warrior of Barsoom is a priceless honor, but to lay my hand on the shoulder of a friend and ally is a far greater boon. Jeddak of Helium, Tarkas replied, "It has taken a man of another world to teach the green warriors of Barsoom the meaning of friendship. To him, we owe this understanding, and the sentiments you have expressed will not be forgotten." Tardos Mors then greeted each green Jeddak and Jed, expressing his friendship and appreciation. When he approached me, he placed both hands on my shoulders. "Welcome, my son," he said. "That you have won, without opposition, the most precious jewel of helium and of all Barsoom is testament to your worth." We were then introduced to Mors Kayak, Jed of Lesser Helium and father of Dejathorus. He followed closely behind Tardos Mors and seemed even more moved by the meeting than his father. Though renowned for his ferocity as a warrior, Mors Kayak worshipped his daughter, and his gratitude was overwhelming. Time and again, he tried to speak, but emotion choked his voice. Chapter 27. From Joy to Death. For 10 days, the hordes of Thark and their wild allies were feasted and entertained. Then, loaded with costly presents and escorted by 10,000 soldiers of helium, commanded by Mors Kayak, they began their return journey to their own lands. The Jed of Lesser Helium, along with a small party of nobles, accompanied them all the way to Thark to further cement the new bonds of peace and friendship. Sola also accompanied Tarkas, her father, who had openly acknowledged her as his daughter before all his chieftains. 3 weeks later, Mors Kayak and his officers, accompanied by Tarkas and Sola, returned on a battleship dispatched to Thark to bring them back in time for the ceremony that would unite Dejathorus and John Carter as one. For 9 years, I served in the councils and fought in the armies of Helium as a prince of the house of Tardos Mors. The people never seemed to tire of heaping honors upon me, and not a day passed without some new proof of their love for my princess, the incomparable Dejathorus. In a golden incubator upon the roof of our palace lay a snow-white egg. For nearly 5 years, 10 soldiers of the Jeddak's guard had constantly stood watch over it. Not a day passed, when I was in the city, that Dejathorus and I did not stand hand in hand before the little shrine, dreaming of the future when the delicate shell would finally break. Vivid in my memory is the picture of the last night, as we sat there talking in low tones about the strange romance that had woven our lives together, and the wonder that would soon augment our happiness and fulfill our hopes. In the distance, we saw the bright white light of an approaching airship, but we attached no particular significance to the sight. It was a common occurrence. However, like a bolt of lightning, the craft raced toward Helium, its speed betraying a sense of urgency, flashing the signals proclaiming it a dispatch bearer for the Jeddak. The ship circled impatiently, awaiting the arrival of the tardy patrol boat that would convoy it to the palace docks. 10 minutes after it docked, a message summoned me to the council chamber, which I found rapidly filling with members of that body. On the raised platform of the throne stood Tardos Mors, pacing back and forth, his face tense and drawn. When all were seated, he turned to address us. "This morning," he said, "word reached the governments of Barsoom that the keeper of the atmosphere plant had failed to send his wireless report for 2 days. Repeated calls from a score of capitals have gone unanswered. The ambassadors of the other nations have asked us to take the matter in hand and hasten the assistant keeper to the plant. All day, 1,000 cruisers have searched for him. Just now, one returned bearing his dead body, found in the pits beneath his house, horribly mutilated by some assassin. I need not tell you what this means for Barsoom. It would take months to penetrate the mighty walls of the plant. Though work has already begun, there would be little to fear if the engines of the pumping plant continued to run as they have for hundreds of years. But the worst has happened. The instruments show rapidly decreasing air pressure across Barsoom. The engine has stopped. My gentlemen," he concluded, "we have, at best, 3 days to live." For several minutes, the chamber was silent. Then a young noble rose, his drawn sword held high above his head, and addressed Tardos Moors. The men of Helium have always prided themselves on showing Barsoom how a nation of red men should live. Now is our chance to show them how we should die. Let us go about our duties as though 1,000 useful years still lay before us. The chamber rang with applause. With nothing better to do than set an example for the people, we went our separate ways, smiles on our faces, but sorrow gnawing at our hearts. When I returned to my palace, I found that the rumor had already reached Dejathoris. I told her everything I had heard. "We have been very happy, John Carter," she said. "I thank whatever fate overtakes us that it permits us to die together." For the next 2 days, there was no noticeable change in the air supply. But on the morning of the third day, breathing became difficult at the higher altitudes of the rooftops. The avenues and plazas of Helium were filled with people. All business had ceased. For the most part, the people faced their impending doom bravely. Here and there, however, men and women succumbed to quiet grief. Toward the middle of the day, many of the weaker began to succumb, and within an hour, the people of Barsoom were collapsing by the thousands into the unconsciousness that precedes death by asphyxiation. Dejathoris and I, along with other members of the royal family, had gathered in a sunken garden within an inner courtyard of the palace. We spoke in low tones, when we spoke at all, as the grim shadow of death crept over us. Even Willa seemed to feel the weight of the impending calamity, pressing close to Dejathoris and me, whining pitifully. At Dejathoris's request, the little incubator had been brought down from the roof of our palace. She sat gazing longingly at the unknown little life she now believed she would never know. As breathing became perceptibly more difficult, Tardos Moors rose and said, "Let us bid each other farewell. The days of Barsoom's greatness are over. Tomorrow's sun will shine upon a dead world, which will swing through eternity, peopled not even by memories. This is the end." He stooped and kissed the women of his family, laying his strong hand upon the shoulders of the men. As I turned away, my eyes fell upon Dejathoris. Her head drooped onto her chest, and she appeared lifeless. With a cry, I sprang to her and raised her in my arms. Her eyes fluttered open and looked into mine. "Kiss me, John Carter," she murmured. "I love you. I love you. It is cruel that we must be torn apart just as we were beginning a life of love and happiness." As I pressed her lips to mine, a surge of unconquerable power and determination rose within me. The fighting blood of Virginia burned hot in my veins. "It shall not be, my princess," I cried. "There is a way. There must be, and John Carter, who fought through a strange world for the love of you, will find it." With my words, a memory surged through my mind like a flash of lightning, a series of 9 long-forgotten sounds, the key to the 3 great doors of the atmosphere plant. Turning to Tardos Moors, I cried, "A flyer, Jeddak. Quickly, order your fastest flyer to the palace roof. I can save Barsoom yet." Without hesitation, a guard raced to the nearest dock. Despite the thin, nearly non-existent air on the rooftop, they managed to launch the fastest one-man air scout machine Barsoomian ingenuity had ever produced. Kissing Dejathoris a dozen times and commanding Willa, who would have followed me, to stay and protect her, I bounded to the high ramparts of the palace. In moments, I was heading toward the last hope of Barsoom. I flew low to find enough air to breathe, skimming across an old sea bottom, only rising a few feet above the ground. I traveled with terrible speed, for this was a race against time and death. The face of Dejathoris hovered before me. As I had turned for a final look before leaving the palace garden, I had seen her stagger and collapse beside the little incubator. I knew she had fallen into the final coma that would end in death if the air supply was not replenished. Throwing caution aside, I discarded everything but the engine and compass, even my ornaments, and lying flat on the deck, I pushed the speed lever to its limit, slicing through the thin air of dying Mars like a meteor. An hour before dark, the great walls of the atmosphere plant loomed ahead. With a sickening thud, I crashed to the ground before the small door that was holding back the life force of an entire planet. Near the door, a crew of men had been trying to breach the wall. They had barely scratched its flint-like surface, and most now lay in the final sleep, from which not even air could awaken them. The air was even thinner here than in helium, and breathing was nearly impossible. A few men were still conscious, and to one of them I spoke. "If I can open these doors, is there a man who can start the engines?" I asked. "I can," he replied weakly. "But hurry, I won't last much longer. It's no use, though they are both dead, and no one else on Barsoom knows the secret of these locks. For 3 days, men crazed with fear have tried in vain to solve their mystery." I had no time to talk. My strength was waning, and it took all my willpower to focus my thoughts. With a final effort, as I sank to my knees, I hurled the 9 thought waves at the terrible locks. Beside me, the Martian stared wide-eyed at the single panel before us. Slowly, the massive door receded. I tried to rise and follow it, but was too weak. "After it," I cried to my companion. "If you reach the pump room, activate all the pumps. It's Barsoom's only chance." From where I lay, I managed to open the second door, then the third. As I watched the hope of Barsoom crawl weakly through the final doorway, I sank unconscious to the ground. Chapter 28. At the Arizona Cave. It was dark when I opened my eyes again. Strange, stiff garments were upon my body garments that cracked and powdered away from me as I rose to a sitting posture. I felt over myself from head to foot and discovered that I was clothed, though when I had fallen unconscious at the little doorway, I had been naked. Before me was a small patch of moonlit sky visible through a ragged aperture. As my hands moved over my body, they came into contact with pockets, and in one of these, I found a small parcel of matches wrapped in oiled paper. Striking one, its dim flame illuminated what appeared to be a vast cave. Toward the back of the cavern, I discerned a strange, still figure huddled over a tiny bench. Approaching cautiously, I saw it was the dead, mummified remains of a small, old woman with long black hair. Before her, on a small charcoal burner, rested a round copper vessel containing a small quantity of greenish powder. Behind her, suspended from the roof on rawhide thongs and stretching across the cave, hung a row of human skeletons. A thong extended from this macabre arrangement to the dead hand of the old woman. When I touched the cord, the skeletons swung with a noise like the rustling of dry leaves. It was a grotesque and horrifying tableau, and I hastened into the fresh air, grateful to escape such a gruesome scene. The sight that met my eyes as I stepped out onto a narrow ledge outside the cave filled me with consternation. A new heaven and a new landscape stretched before me. The silvered mountains in the distance, the nearly stationary moon hanging in the sky, and the cacti-studded valley below were not of Mars. I could scarcely believe my eyes, but the truth slowly forced itself upon me. I was looking at Arizona from the same ledge where, 10 years before, I had gazed longingly at Mars. Burying my head in my arms, I turned, broken and sorrowful, down the trail from the cave. Above me shone the red eye of Mars, holding her awful secret, 48 million miles away. Had the Martian reached the pump room? Had the vitalizing air saved the people of that distant planet in time? Was my Digithoris alive? Or did her beautiful body lie cold in death beside the tiny golden incubator in the sunken garden of the Palace of Tardos Mors? Jeddak of helium? For 10 years, I have waited and prayed for an answer to these questions. For 10 years, I have longed and prayed to be taken back to the world of my lost love. I would rather lie dead beside her there than live here on Earth, millions of miles from her. The old mine, which I found untouched, has made me fabulously wealthy. But what care I for wealth? As I sit here tonight in my little study overlooking the Hudson River, 20 years have passed since I first opened my eyes upon Mars. Through the small window by my desk, I see Mars shining in the sky. Tonight, she seems to call to me as she has not called since that long dead night. I think I can see, across the vast abyss of space, a beautiful black-haired woman standing in the garden of a palace. Beside her is a little boy who wraps his arms around her as she points toward the planet Earth. At their feet lies a huge, hideous creature with a heart of gold. I believe they are waiting for me, and something tells me I shall soon know.
Thank you so much for joining me today and listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. If you liked today's tale, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to see you next time for another magical adventure. Until then, take care and keep imagining.